The evening sky had turned a deep shade of gray as rain clouds gathered over downtown Boston. Andrew Thompson wiped the sweat from his forehead as he gathered his coaching whistle and clipboard, wrapping up another intense basketball practice at Lincoln Heights High School. His team was getting better every day, and watching those kids grow both on and off the court filled his heart with pride. "Great job today, everyone," he called out to the last few students heading to the locker room. "Remember to study for those tests tomorrow." The echoes of squeaking sneakers and bouncing basketballs gradually faded away, replaced by the soft patter of rain starting to fall outside. Andrew pulled his jacket closer around his shoulders and stepped out into the drizzle. The streetlights were just beginning to flicker on, casting warm golden pools onto the wet sidewalk. He could have taken the bus, but the walk home always helped clear his mind after a long day of teaching and coaching. Plus, he enjoyed seeing the city wind down for the evening, watching families through lit windows settling in for dinner, smelling the mix of different cuisines wafting from restaurant doorways, and hearing the distant rumble of the T trains carrying tired workers home. As he passed Morrison's, that fancy grocery store where a gallon of milk cost nearly twice what it did at the corner market, something caught his eye. An elderly white woman, probably in her mid-70s, was struggling with several paper bags of groceries. She wore an elegant beige coat that was getting spotted with rain, and her silver hair was starting to droop from the moisture. Andrew noticed her hands trembling as she tried to juggle the heavy bags. The paper was getting wet and starting to tear at the bottom. More importantly, her feet were unsteady on the slick sidewalk. He quickened his pace, concern growing as he watched her teeter slightly. "Just a few more steps to my car," she muttered to herself, not noticing the broken piece of sidewalk ahead. Time seemed to slow down as Andrew saw what was about to happen. The woman's foot caught the uneven concrete, and her balance finally gave way. Without thinking, Andrew lunged forward, his basketball reflexes kicking in. One arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders while the other caught her shopping bags, preventing both her and her groceries from crashing to the ground. "Oh," she gasped, her blue eyes wide with surprise as she found herself safely supported instead of sprawled on the wet concrete. "I've got you, ma'am," Andrew said softly, helping her regain her footing. "Aren't you all right?" The woman placed a shaky hand over her heart, taking a few deep breaths. "My goodness, young man, you appeared like a guardian angel. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." Andrew smiled warmly, still keeping a steadying hand near her elbow. "I'm just glad I was passing by at the right time. These sidewalks can be treacherous when they're wet. Would you like help getting to your car?" The woman looked around, appearing slightly disoriented. "Oh dear, I'm afraid in my confusion earlier, I forgot where I parked. Everything looks different in this rain." "That's no problem at all," Andrew replied, now holding all of her grocery bags securely. "We can walk together until you spot it. Which direction do you think you came from?" As they began walking slowly down the street, the woman introduced herself. "I'm Elizabeth Bennett," she said, her voice growing steadier. "I don't usually do my own shopping anymore, but my regular delivery service was closed today, and I was craving my favorite tea biscuits that only Morrison's carries." "Those must be some pretty special biscuits," Andrew chuckled. "I'm Andrew Thompson. I coach basketball at Lincoln Heights, just a few blocks from here." Elizabeth's face lit up. "A basketball coach. How wonderful. My late husband absolutely loved basketball. He used to take our grandchildren to every Celtics game he could. Said it taught them about teamwork and perseverance better than any classroom could." As they continued their conversation, neither of them noticed that the rain had started falling harder, or that they were drawing curious glances from other pedestrians, an unlikely pair, walking arm in arm through the gathering dusk, sharing stories and gentle laughter as if they'd known each other for years instead of minutes. What Andrew couldn't know was that this chance encounter on a rainy evening would change not only his life, but the lives of countless others in ways he never could have imagined. But that part of the story was still to come. After walking a few blocks in the rain, Elizabeth suddenly stopped and pointed to a stunning brownstone building with intricate stonework and large bay windows. "Oh, I completely forgot. My car is actually at home. I walked to the store because it was so lovely earlier. Would you mind helping me just a bit further? I live right there." Andrew looked up at the magnificent building, raindrops running down his face. "Of course, ma'am. Let's get you and these groceries somewhere dry. As they climbed the front steps, Elizabeth fumbled with her keys, her hands still shaking slightly from her near fall. Andrew patiently waited, grocery bags secure in his arms, providing a steadying presence beside her. The heavy wooden door creaked open, revealing a warmly lit foyer with marble floors and dark wood paneling. "Please come in for a moment," Elizabeth insisted, gesturing toward an elegant sitting room. "I simply must thank you properly, and you're soaked to the bone. Let me at least make you a cup of tea." Andrew hesitated, water dripping from his jacket onto the pristine floor. "I wouldn't want to impose." "Nonsense," Elizabeth cut in with a gentle smile. "You've done me such a kindness. Besides, I haven't had anyone to talk to properly in days. My housekeeper is visiting her sister, and these old rooms get terribly quiet." Something in her voice, a hint of loneliness perhaps, made Andrew set down the grocery bags and follow her into the sitting room. The space was like stepping into another era, with oil paintings in gilded frames and furniture that belonged in a museum. But there were also comfortable touches. A half-finished crossword puzzle on the coffee table, reading glasses perched on top of a well-worn novel, family photos crowding every surface. Elizabeth disappeared briefly and returned with 2 steaming cups of tea and a plate of the very biscuits she'd risked the rain to purchase. "These are worth a little adventure now and then," she said with a wink, settling into a high-backed armchair. As they sipped their tea, Elizabeth's eyes fell on a large photograph above the fireplace. It showed a distinguished-looking man standing proudly next to a gleaming red sports car. "That's my Thomas," she said softly. "He passed away 3 years ago. Would you believe he kept that Ferrari in perfect condition for 30 years? Barely drove it, said he was saving it for something special, though he never did say what." Andrew studied the photograph with interest. "That's a beautiful car. My father would have loved to see something like that up close. He was a mechanic his whole life, had a real passion for fine automobiles." Elizabeth sat up straighter, her eyes brightening. "Oh, where did he work?" "Worthington Motors, over in Cambridge. He was there for 20 years, until he passed away last spring." Andrew's voice grew quiet. "He always said it was the best job he ever had. Mr. Worthington treated his employees like family, made sure everyone's kids had presents at Christmas, helped with college funds." Elizabeth's teacup clattered against its saucer. "Did you say Worthington Motors?" Her voice trembled. "Young man, that was my Thomas's company. He built that business from the ground up. What was your father's name?" "Robert Thompson," Andrew replied, surprised by her reaction. "Everyone called him Bobby." Tears welled up in Elizabeth's eyes. "Bobby Thompson. I remember him. Thomas spoke of him often. He was one of our very best mechanics, had a special touch with the exotic cars." She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "He helped restore that very Ferrari in the photograph." Thomas was heartbroken when he heard about his passing. The room fell silent except for the soft ticking of an antique clock and the patter of rain against the windows. Both Andrew and Elizabeth sat absorbing the strange connection that had just been revealed, how their paths had crossed years before through the men they'd both lost. "Life has a funny way of bringing things full circle," Elizabeth finally said, reaching over to pat Andrew's hand. "Your father was a good man, and clearly his son is too." Andrew smiled, though his eyes were misty. "Thank you, ma'am. That means a lot to hear." As they continued talking, sharing stories about Bobby Thompson and Thomas Worthington, neither could have guessed that this was just the beginning. That somehow, through a chance encounter on a rainy evening, the legacy of both men was about to take an extraordinary turn. By the time Andrew left Elizabeth's brownstone that evening, the rain had finally stopped, and the streets glistened under the streetlights. His mind was swimming with all the stories she'd shared about his father, little details he'd never known, like how Bobby would sing old Motown songs while working on engines, or how he'd kept a photo of Andrew's high school graduation taped inside his toolbox. The next morning dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for outdoor basketball practice. Andrew arrived early at Lincoln Heights, as he always did, to set up the court and review his practice plans. The morning sun warmed his face as he laid out cones for dribbling drills, his mind still drifting back to last night's unexpected encounter. He thought about his own dream of starting a youth basketball program. It was something he'd been saving for, putting aside a little from each paycheck, but at this rate, it would take years to gather enough funding. The city's underprivileged kids needed positive outlets now, not 5 years down the road. "Hey, coach," called out Deshawn, one of his most promising players, jogging across the parking lot. "What's that fancy car doing here?" Andrew looked up, squinting against the morning sun. His heart nearly stopped. There, pulling into the school parking lot, was a Ferrari, not just any Ferrari, but one that looked exactly like the one from Elizabeth's photograph. The gleaming red paint caught the sunlight like liquid fire, and the engine purred with a sound that would have made his father weak in the knees. The car came to a stop near the basketball court, drawing a small crowd of early arriving students who gathered at a respectful distance, phones out to capture this unusual sight. The driver's door opened, and a well-dressed man in his mid-30s stepped out. He looked around until his eyes landed on Andrew. "Coach Thompson," he called out, walking over with an envelope in one hand and what looked like a set of keys in the other. "I'm William Worthington, Elizabeth's grandson. She sent me." Andrew's mind raced as he shook William's hand. The students whispered excitedly among themselves, phones still recording every moment. William smiled, gesturing to the Ferrari. "My grandmother told me about what happened last night," he began. "She also told me about your father, Buddy. I remember him, I was just a kid, but he used to let me sit in the fancy cars while he worked on them. Said every young man should know what it feels like to sit behind the wheel of their dreams." He paused, looking at the Ferrari with a mix of nostalgia and purpose. "This car was my grandfather's pride and joy. He bought it for 3 decades, kept it in perfect condition. But you know what's funny? He never drove it much. Always said he was waiting for the right moment, the right purpose." William held out the envelope and keys to Andrew, whose hands trembled slightly as he took them. "Grandma Elizabeth stayed up half the night making phone calls and arranging paperwork. She said she finally understood what Grandpa Thomas had been waiting for. The car, and what's in that envelope, they're yours now." Andrew stared at the items in his hands, unable to form words. The envelope felt heavy, substantial. The keys felt impossible, like holding a piece of a dream. "But I can't possibly," he started. William held up a hand. "My grandmother said you'd try to refuse. She also said to tell you that some things are meant to be. The way you helped her last night, the connection to your father, your dedication to these kids." He gestured to the students still watching in awe. "She said it's time for this car to fulfill its purpose, just like you're fulfilling yours." The morning sun continued to rise over Lincoln Heights, casting long shadows across the basketball court as Andrew stood there, keys in hand, surrounded by his wide-eyed students. In that moment, he felt his father's presence so strongly it took his breath away. Somehow, through a simple act of kindness on a rainy evening, the past and present had woven together in ways he never could have imagined. But even as he stood there, stunned by this turn of events, Andrew didn't know that this was just the beginning. The envelope in his hand, the keys to that gleaming Ferrari, they were about to open doors he never even knew existed, changing not just his life, but the lives of countless young people in his community. With shaking hands, Andrew opened the envelope William had given him. Inside was a letter written in Elizabeth's elegant handwriting, along with several official-looking documents. As he read, his students gathered closer, their morning practice temporarily forgotten in the excitement of the moment. "Dear Andrew," the letter began. "Some people might call last night's encounter a coincidence, but I believe it was something more. You see, Thomas always said that everything in life happens for a reason. That Ferrari sitting in our garage for 30 years? He was waiting for the right purpose, the right person. Now I understand why. Inside this envelope, you'll find the car's title, transferred to your name. But there's something else too, a check that represents what Thomas would have wanted. He always believed in investing in young people's futures, just like he invested in your father's dreams of sending you to college. I've included a check for $250,000. Use it to start that youth basketball program you talked about. Give these kids the same chance that Thomas gave to so many others over the years. Your father would be proud to see you carrying on this legacy of helping others." Andrew had to pause reading, his vision blurring with tears. The students around him were unusually quiet, sensing the weight of the moment. William stood nearby, smiling softly, his own eyes a bit misty. "Coach?" One of his players, Anthony, spoke up. "Are you okay?" Andrew took a deep breath, looking at the young faces around him. These kids, many of whom came from struggling families just like he had, who found their sanctuary on this basketball court just like he once did. They were the reason all of this was happening. "I'm better than okay," he managed to say. "How would you all feel about having a real youth basketball program here? Not just school teams, but something bigger? Something that could help kids all over the city." The excitement that erupted was immediate and infectious. Students started talking all at once, sharing ideas and dreams that had always seemed out of reach before. Could we have summer leagues? What about training camps? Can we help teach the younger kids? William stepped forward again, placing a hand on Andrew's shoulder. "There's more," he said. "Grandma Elizabeth made some calls last night. The old Worthington Motors building in Cambridge. The one where your father worked? It's been sitting empty since the company moved to their new location. She wants to donate it to your program. It's got plenty of space for indoor courts, classrooms, maybe even a community center." Andrew stared at him in disbelief. The old Worthington building had been like a second home to him as a kid. He used to do his homework in the break room while his father finished up his shifts. The thought of turning it into something that could help hundreds of kids, it seemed almost too perfect to be real. The morning sun had fully risen now, casting a golden glow over the school's basketball court. Students were still buzzing with excitement, some making calls to share the news, others already drawing up plans for what the program could be. Andrew looked at the Ferrari keys in his hand, then at the check and paperwork in the envelope. He thought about his father, about Thomas Worthington, about Elizabeth and her incredible gesture of trust and generosity. He thought about all the lives that could be changed because of one simple moment of kindness on a rainy evening. His phone buzzed, a text from Elizabeth. "Come by for tea again soon. We have lots of planning to do." Just then, the school bell rang, snapping everyone back to the present moment. The students began gathering their bags, still chattering excitedly about the morning's events. "All right, everyone," Andrew called out, his coach's voice returning. "Time for class. But tomorrow we start building something special." As the kids headed inside, Andrew stood alone on the court, the Ferrari gleaming in the morning sun behind him. The weight of possibilities settled on his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a gift. Something his father had once told him echoed in his mind. "Son, sometimes the biggest dreams come true in the most unexpected ways." Looking at the school building, then at the Ferrari, then at the old Worthington building visible in the distance, Andrew couldn't help but smile. His father had been right. And this was just the beginning. Word spread quickly through the city about what had happened at Lincoln Heights that morning. By lunchtime, local news vans were parked outside the school, and Andrew's phone wouldn't stop ringing with calls from reporters wanting to hear the story firsthand. The school principal called Andrew into her office, her face beaming with excitement. "This is incredible, Andrew. Do you know what this could mean for our students?" She was already thinking about the possibilities, about how many more kids they could help, about the opportunities this could create. Andrew sat in her office, still trying to process everything himself. "It doesn't feel real yet," he admitted. "Yesterday I was just trying to help someone who needed it. Now," he gestured helplessly at his phone, which was buzzing again with another reporter's call. "That's exactly why this is happening," the principal said warmly. "Because you weren't trying to get anything out of it. You were just being who you are." By the afternoon, a local news crew had set up in the gym. They wanted to film Andrew with his basketball team to capture the spirit of what made this story so special. The reporter, a kind-faced woman with bright eyes, asked Andrew what he planned to do with such an incredible gift. Andrew looked around at his players, who were trying their best to act natural in front of the cameras. "You know, when I was their age, basketball saved my life," he said honestly. "It gave me somewhere to go after school, kept me focused, taught me about dedication and teamwork. But it wasn't just the game, it was the people who cared enough to coach us, to show up for us, to believe in us." He paused, gathering his thoughts. That's what this program is going to be about, not just basketball, but creating a place where kids know they matter, where they can get help with homework, where they can find mentors and role models, where they can dream big and get the support they need to chase those dreams. The camera crew then went to film the Ferrari still parked in the school lot. Word had gotten around the neighborhood, and local kids pressed their faces against the chain-link fence, trying to get a glimpse of the spectacular car. But Andrew noticed something interesting. It wasn't just the car they were looking at. They were watching him too. In their eyes, he could see something new, possibility. Later that afternoon, Elizabeth arrived at the school. She moved slowly with her cane, but held her head high, elegant as ever. The news crews immediately turned their attention to her, but she only had eyes for Andrew and his team. "I brought cookies," she announced, holding up a large tin. "Homemade this time, not from Morrison's." The students gathered around, and Elizabeth took a seat on the bleachers, sharing stories about Thomas and the early days of Worthington Motors. She told them about how Thomas had started with just one small garage, about how he believed in giving people chances, about how he never forgot where he came from. "You know," she said, looking at Andrew, "Thomas always said that success isn't about how much money you make or what kind of car you drive. It's about how many lives you touch, how many people you help along the way." One of the younger players raised his hand. "Ma'am, does this mean Coach Andrew is going to stop teaching here?" Elizabeth smiled and shook her head. "Oh no, dear, this is just the beginning. We're going to build something right here, something that will help even more young people. And we're going to need your coach more than ever." The afternoon light slanted through the gym windows, creating long shadows on the court. The news crews were packing up their equipment, but the story they captured was just beginning to unfold. Elizabeth and Andrew sat together on the bleachers, watching the students practice, starting to plan what would come next. "You know," Elizabeth said softly, "I haven't felt this excited about something in years." Thomas would have loved this, seeing his car, his old building, everything he worked for being used to help young people chase their dreams. Andrew nodded, thinking about his own father, about how proud he would be. The sound of basketballs bouncing and sneakers squeaking filled the gym, familiar sounds that now carried new promise, new possibility. A young student walked up to them, hesitating slightly. "Coach, my little brother, he really loves basketball, but our mom can't afford the league fees. When the new program starts," he trailed off, hopeful. Andrew smiled, feeling the weight of the future in that simple question. "Tell your brother to come see me tomorrow. We're going to make sure everyone who wants to play gets a chance." The boy's face lit up as he ran off to practice. Elizabeth patted Andrew's hand, her eyes twinkling. "And that," she said, "is exactly why this was meant to be." The story took on a life of its own over the next few days. Social media exploded with shares and comments, and major news networks picked up the story. But what touched people most wasn't the Ferrari or the money, it was the simple act of kindness that had started it all. One morning, Andrew arrived at school to find his inbox flooded with emails from across the country. There were messages from retired teachers offering to volunteer, coaches wanting to help with summer programs, and even professional basketball players interested in running workshops for the kids. "Coach," called out Anthony, running up to him in the hallway. "Have you seen this?" He held up his phone, showing a video that had gone viral. Someone had captured the moment the Ferrari arrived at school, but they'd also included clips of Andrew working with his team, staying late to help struggling students, and giving up his lunch breaks to open the gym for kids who needed a safe place to play. The comments below the video were filled with stories from former students, sharing how Andrew had helped them through tough times, bought them lunch when they were hungry, or just listened when they needed someone to talk to. One comment stood out. "This is what a real hero looks like, someone who helps others every day, not just when the cameras are watching." Later that day, Elizabeth visited the old Worthington Motors building with Andrew. The space was dusty and empty, but the potential was everywhere. The high ceilings could easily accommodate basketball courts, and the old offices could become classrooms and counseling spaces. "Look at this," Elizabeth said, pointing to a faded photograph on the wall. It showed Thomas Worthington standing with his first group of employees, including Andrew's father Bobby, all smiling proudly in front of the newly opened building. They all started with just a dream and the willingness to work hard. As they walked through the space, Elizabeth shared her vision. "We'll have after-school programs, tutoring, job training. Young people need more than just sports. They need opportunities, guidance, someone to believe in them." She turned to Andrew with tears in her eyes. "Just like Thomas believed in your father, and just like your father believed in you." The local community was already rallying around the project. Small business owners offered to provide meals for the after-school programs. A construction company volunteered to help renovate the building. The city council fast-tracked the permits needed to convert the space. But the most touching responses came from the kids themselves. During practice that afternoon, Andrew overheard his players making plans. "We could help coach the younger kids," one suggested. "Yeah, and maybe start a mentoring program," added another. "My mom's really good at math," she said she'd help with tutoring. The students were no longer just thinking about their own games and practices. They were thinking about how they could help others, how they could be part of something bigger than themselves. That evening, as Andrew was leaving school, he found a hand-drawn card taped to his office door. Inside were messages from his team. "Thank you for showing us what's possible. You're changing lives, Coach. Now we can help other kids like you helped us." The media attention was starting to die down, but the real story was just beginning. People weren't talking about the Ferrari anymore. They were talking about hope, about community, about the power of simple acts of kindness to change lives. Andrew sat in his office, looking at the card, thinking about how one rainy evening had set all of this in motion. His phone buzzed with a text from Elizabeth, having tea and sorting through old photos. "Found some wonderful ones of your father. Come by when you can. We have more stories to share." He smiled, thinking about how life had come full circle. His father had always told him that true wealth wasn't about money, it was about what you gave back to others. Now, looking at the growing pile of emails from people wanting to help, the excited chatter of students planning for the future, and the community coming together to support their dreams, Andrew understood exactly what his father had meant. The Ferrari keys sat on his desk, catching the late afternoon sun. But they weren't just keys to a car anymore. They were keys to possibility, to opportunity, to hope. And that was worth more than any luxury vehicle could ever be. 1 year later, the old Worthington Motors building was transformed. The grand opening drew hundreds of people from across the city. Where old cars once stood, gleaming basketball courts now stretched the length of the building. Former offices had become tutoring rooms, computer labs, and study spaces. The break room, where Andrew used to do his homework, was now a college planning center. Andrew stood at the entrance, greeting families as they arrived. The Ferrari was parked out front, not as a show of wealth, but as a symbol of what had started it all. He decided early on that the car would be better used to help even more kids. Next week, it would be auctioned off, with all proceeds going to fund scholarships for the program. "Coach," called a familiar voice. Anthony, now a senior, was leading a group of younger kids on a tour. "Want to tell them about the rainy night story?" The children gathered around eagerly. They'd all heard pieces of it, but it had become something of a legend at the center. Elizabeth sat in a comfortable chair near the main court, which had been named in memory of Thomas Worthington. She came by almost every day now, helping with homework, sharing stories, and becoming a grandmother figure to many of the kids. Today, she was surrounded by a group of young girls who were showing her their college application essays. "You know," she said to Andrew as he passed by, "Thomas would have loved seeing his old building like this, full of life, full of dreams." She gestured to the walls, where photographs told the story of both buildings, the old Worthington Motors and the new youth center. And Bobby would have been so proud. The center had already made a difference in hundreds of young lives. The after-school program was full to capacity, with a waiting list growing longer each week. Test scores were up at local schools, and juvenile crime rates had dropped significantly in the neighborhood. But the real success stories were the small ones, the quiet victories that happened every day. Like the shy kid who finally found his voice in the public speaking workshop, or the struggling student who discovered she was a math whiz once she got the right help, or the young athlete who learned that being a leader meant helping others succeed. The auction for the Ferrari was set for next weekend. Collectors from around the world had expressed interest, knowing the car's unique history. But more importantly, they knew what the money would be used for. A scholarship fund that would help send kids to college, just like Thomas Worthington had once helped Bobby Thompson send his son to school. As the opening day celebrations continued, Andrew took a quiet moment in his office. Photos covered one wall, his father in his mechanic's uniform, Thomas Worthington with his beloved Ferrari, Elizabeth on the night of their chance meeting, and dozens of smiling faces of kids whose lives were being changed. His phone buzzed with a text from one of his former players who was now in college. "Hey coach, guess what? Made the dean's list this semester. Thanks for never letting me give up." Outside his office, he could hear the sound of basketballs bouncing, kids laughing, tutors working with students, and volunteers planning upcoming events. The center had become exactly what they dreamed of, not just a gym, but a place of possibility. Elizabeth appeared in his doorway, leaning on her cane but standing tall. "Time for the ceremony," she said with a smile. They were about to announce the first recipients of the Bobby Thompson Memorial Scholarship. As they walked together toward the main court, Elizabeth patted his arm. "You know, I never did tell you why Thomas kept that Ferrari all those years without driving it. He used to say he was waiting for the right moment, the right purpose. But I think what he was really waiting for was the right person to give it to, someone who would understand that its true value wasn't in its price tag, but in what it could do for others." The main court was packed with families, community members, and media crews capturing this milestone moment. As Andrew stepped up to the microphone, he looked out at the sea of faces, young and old, from all walks of life, all part of this amazing journey that started with a simple act of kindness on a rainy evening. "1 year ago," he began, "we learned that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices. That when we help others without expecting anything in return, we create ripples that can change entire communities. Today, we're not just celebrating a building or a program. We're celebrating what happens when people come together to believe in something bigger than themselves." He paused, looking at Elizabeth, who wiped away a tear. "And we're celebrating 2 men who taught us that true legacy isn't about what you have, it's about what you give." Thomas Worthington and Bobby Thompson may not be here to see this day, but their spirit lives on in every life we touch, every dream we help come true, and every kid who walks through these doors knowing they have a chance at a better future. The crowd erupted in applause, but the real music was in the sounds of daily life at the center, the bounce of basketballs, the scratch of pencils on paper, the quiet conversations between mentors and students, the laughter of kids who had found their place to belong. This was the true happy ending, not just one moment of celebration, but the promise of countless moments to come, countless lives to be changed, countless dreams to be realized. And it all started because 2 strangers chose to see the best in each other on a rainy evening in Boston.